Welcome to another ADLC Northland Social Studies video. Today we will be looking at the period of time between Detente during the Cold War and the evolution of modern Russia. Remember that the Cold War was essentially based on a war of ideological beliefs and values, pitting the two large superpowers, the United States and Soviet Union, creating a battle of democracy and capitalism versus authoritarianism and communism. Whereas the first half of the Cold War was characterized by fear, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and thoughts of mutually assured destruction, a period began in the 1970s known as Detente. Detente is a period where tensions are reduced. Significant expense from the arms race for the USSR and an expensive unpopular war in Vietnam for the US were just a couple of the motivating factors during this time to reduce tensions. Both sides were also extremely concerned with the mutually assured destruction, and this led to the idea of signing treaties. A series of treaties were signed during this period. They included the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or SALT, both 1 and 2, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, the Partial Test Ban Treaty, and the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. These were all designed to reduce tension, and often included reduction of weapon piles, limits on the amount of weapons each side could have, and agreements on nuclear issues between powers. The problem with these treaties is that there was mistrust between the parties, and fear of a shift in the balance of power often caused both parties to ignore treaties. But the period did offer an uneasy peace. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the leader of the Soviet Union. Although he was a communist, he had very liberal ideas. As communist countries were adopting more liberal forms of government around the Soviet Union, Gorbachev saw that the Soviet Union had no other option than to introduce modern liberal reform. He did this in two major reform policies. The first, glasnost, which means openness. The Soviet government had made decisions based on the good of the country and not its citizens, and was now ready to become transparent. Government decisions would now be based on the will of the people, and the people would be allowed to voice opinions on matters without fear or punishment of imprisonment. This was quite a large change from the ruthlessness of Stalin. Gorbachev also introduced a liberal economic policy called perestroika, which allowed some free enterprise and individual choice in the Soviet Union, moving the country closer to a market economy. As Gorbachev liberalized the economy, demands for change grew. Under perestroika, the Russian economy started to depend more on markets and to depend less on central planning. Many communist members of the Soviet Union opposed change. If the Soviet Union became democratic, most communist government officials would lose their job. The Soviet government was already corrupt, and corruption became more obvious with perestroika. Jobs were no longer guaranteed under perestroika. Unemployment and corruption grew. Many workers were unskilled and were not able to find good-paying jobs. Most old members of the communist government had connections and abused their power to open stores and control the market. In 1989, Polish shipyard workers started a strike demanding better working conditions and an increase in salary. However, Poland was communist, and communists were not allowed to strike. The strikers joined together to establish the Solidarity movement. The Polish government was not able to stop the movement, which proved to be anti-communist. Eventually, Poland declared itself independent from communism and the Soviet Empire. The success of this movement away from the Soviet domination and communism encouraged other countries to declare independence. Soon, other countries in the communist Eastern European bloc held democratic elections and declared themselves free from the Soviet Union. The final nail seemed to be put in the communist coffin with the fall of the Berlin Wall. In 1989, the wall which had divided East and West Berlin came down. Finally, families who had been separated for 30 years were able to be reunited. For those who had suffered at the hands of the communist dictatorship, the end of the Soviet era was a period of excitement and insecurity. For communist countries that were ruled by dictators, the right to elect their leaders democratically was a new challenge. Political parties were embraced for their opposing opinions, and a new sense of political ownership was evident. This political ownership also brought about fear. Under a communist regime, all citizens were guaranteed jobs. The new regime meant disintegration of communism. Jobs were no longer guaranteed, and many people were laid off. Prices soared, and unemployment became an issue for people. International concerns over political corruption in the Russian government and its perceived influence and interference by Moscow in the political workings of former satellite states still exist today. These are evident in several international incidents, including the poisoning of pro-Western candidate Viktor Yushchenko in the Ukraine in 2004, the 5-day invasion of the Republic of Georgia in 2008, and the public unrest and accusations of fraud that followed the re-election of Vladimir Putin in 2012. This has been another ADLC production.